Okay, everybody's seen those videos with those property gurus that tell you you can get a property putting no money down. But can you actually secure a property with no money down? That is the question. And what with Section 24 coming into full flow, property landlords have been looking for alternatives. So in this video, we will be looking into rent-to-rent to see if you really can buy a property with no money down and how it compares as an alternative to purchasing your own property. Hello, welcome back to our channel and podcast. My name is Gemma, and here at WS we talk about all things relating to money, mortgages and positive money mindset. So if that interests you, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the thumbs up. It really helps with our YouTube algorithm. That means that you won't miss out on any of our videos. On today's episode of Let's Talk Money and Mortgages, we have Iftika joining us once again today. Hey Ifti, how are you?
Hi, I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Gemma?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Now, for those of you who don't know, Ifti has been in the mortgage industry for over 10 years and he is one of the founding partners here at WIS. Pleasure to have you back.
Yeah, it's lovely to be back as always, Gemma. Thank you.
Okay, Ifti, so there's a lot of hype at the moment going around, with these rent-to-rent properties. And there are a lot of people charging for courses on how to make money with no money down and no risk. And we just want to understand, is this really true? So let's kick it off with, what is rent-to-rent?
Rent-to-rent is what it actually says in the tin, right? So you rent out a property from someone and then you rent it out to someone else. So that's what rent-to-rent means. I'll give you an example because that might be the best way to explain it. Say for example, you rented out a property for say £500 and then you rented out this property which has 3 bedrooms by converting the living room to say the 4th bedroom, right? So you rent it out room by room. Say you got say £400 as rent for each room. So you'll be making 1600. So 1600 minus £500 is £1100. Obviously, because you're responsible for the whole house, you'll have to pay council tax, electricity, gas, water, and any maintenance. Let's call that, say, another £500. So you can make a profit of £600. So that's kind of the concept of rent-to-rent. So that's how it actually works.
Right, so basically somebody rents out a property from somebody else and then rents it out room by room to other people.
Yeah, that's right. That's the most common one. Sometimes you do it, they give it as one let as well, but most of the time to be profitable, people give it room by room. That's the most popular method.
Right, okay, so on the tin, it does look like this could be a profitable route. But what are the other positives and why is it popular?
So it's very popular because of this profit thing. So if you can achieve these numbers, which I told you earlier, obviously it is profitable. I'll say there's about 5 reasons for people to do rent-to-rent. One is it's profitable. The second thing is the tax changes which you mentioned earlier, Section 24. So Section 24 is a tax change which came into full flow this financial year. So what Section 24 means is if you are a landlord, you cannot deduct interest as a cost anymore in full. So that's going to affect a lot of landlords. So landlords have been looking at ways around this. And obviously rent-to-rent is one of the propositions that they can see. Second reason is also a tax reason, because what happens with rent-to-rent is you don't own the property. So if you sell the property in future, there's capital gains if you're a landlord, but with rent-to-rent, there's no capital gains. The fourth one is probably the most important one, the cash flow. Now, if you're a landlord, the cash flow is money that you have to put down buying the property, to 25% of the property value as a deposit. So if you're doing that, that's a lot of outlay. The initial outlay is quite high. But if you're doing rent-to-rent, you don't have that problem because you're renting out the property. Yes, there is some cash flow. You have to pay a few months worth of rent. You may have to pay a small deposit down. And also you may have to do some modifications to the house before you rent it out, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the fourth reason why I would want to do that as well. And that's one of the most popular ones, right? The fifth one is a lot of people use this as a stepping stone towards being a property landlord because they get the experience without the money, see how you fit in the space, you're testing the waters. If it works for you, you will be serious and then you might move on to be an experienced HMO landlord or a landlord by yourself, right? So this is a stepping stone as well. So those are probably the 5 most reasons why people will get into this area.
Because I do want to kind of point out that, like, kind of what you just said, a lot of people advertise it as like a no money down thing, but really you do have to put some money down because you are still renting a property which you will have to pay potentially the first and last month's rent as a deposit. So yeah, there is a little bit of cost incurred, isn't there?
There is some cash flow, but it's not as bad as putting down 25%. So I think that's why a lot of people talk about it.
It's a cheaper route.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, now we've come up with 7 points that we think that you should be mindful of if you are getting into this area. So we'll kick off the first one. It's kind of a good point actually, but I guess it's more of a point from sort of the landlord's perspective. You know, will mortgage companies actually allow you to do this? So yeah, what's kind of their perspective on that, Ifti?
Okay, so it's very safe if the landlord owns the property outright and he doesn't have a mortgage, right? So if that's the case, it's very helpful because it's quite straightforward because you have a commercial arrangement with the landlord. So that's quite clean. Now this is where things get complicated. It'll get complicated if there's a residential mortgage. Sometimes the landlord does have a consent to let, or if it's a buy-to-let mortgage. If it's a standard buy-to-let, usually those agreements wouldn't allow the landlord to sort of sublet this property to somebody else who will have this commercial subletting arrangement. So that is normally prohibited on your agreement. From a landlord's point of view, they can only give it out on a short-term tenancy agreement. Now, sometimes landlords don't know that, because they've not gone through the agreement, and they'll give it out to you. Now you, as a rent-to-rent landlord, you got to be careful because if the landlord has a problem, it eventually becomes your problem, right? Because they might pull out and then you might left with, you would have put down money in the house, right, to make it livable. So all those costs gone, right? So you have to be very careful. So don't get too tempted. Just do a little bit more research, ask the right questions from the landlord before you go into this area. But obviously, like the example say, it could be profitable, but you have to make sure that you're covering all your bases as well.
Yeah, you don't want to be out of pocket, do you?
Definitely not. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so number 2 is, do you need an HMO license to rent out? Rent to rent?
Sometimes you may have to get HMO license. It depends on the council. That's the right answer.
Yeah.
Usually if you have about 5 tenants in a property, you need to get a HMO license for sure. But then what happens is, it depends. Certain councils have slightly different rules. So before you embark on this area, just make sure that you check the rules properly with the council to make sure that you do not need HMO license. Obviously, if you're going in that route, you may need the license because that's additional cost and additional compliance if you're going the HMO route, right? So just make sure that you don't need these, or if you need it, make sure you have it in place, right, before you rent out the property.
I think you can find out the information on the council's website, right? For the HMO.
That's right. Check the local council. That's the first place you want to start off with, for sure.
Okay, cool. Point number 3, you may need planning permission. Talk us through that one, Ifti.
Yeah, so often you don't, but these are things that you need to be mindful, right? So if you are changing the structure of the house, right? I'm not talking about structural changes, but you're changing the living room to another bedroom and you're doing certain changes, Sometimes you may have to extend the house a little bit. Maybe it's a temporary structure, but you may do that, right? You just need to make sure that you don't need planning permission, but likewise, if you need planning permission, just make sure you get it, right? So, because otherwise you might be caught out. If somebody complains again to the council, you might be in trouble. So if you're trying to do this, just make sure that you've got all the relevant permissions before you embark on this, right? So just be very careful with these things because you could get caught out. I mean, a lot of people say it's easy to do, but these are things you have to be mindful of for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Point number 4 is, I think, such a good point. And it's one of these points that I don't think, when you watch these other videos where they talk about rent to rent, they make it sound really easy. But then the reality is, what if you can't rent out the property? Like, what if for months and months you have 2 rooms that are empty? Then what?
Yeah, of course. If you're out of pocket, you could be out of pocket, right? Obviously, with rent to rent, you got to be careful. Because obviously, if you're going to give out 4 rooms, you need to make sure that there's 4 tenants at any given point. That's when you're most profitable. So for that to work, you have to do your proper market research. So do your research to make sure that it's a sought after area and it's easy to rent out. Because the last thing you want is empty rooms because that affects your margin, right? So it has to be appealing. I think this sort of thing works very well if you're close to a town where there's a lot of demand, close to a railway line, close to an airport, it can work for you, right? So just be very careful. Do your research before you go on it. Obviously, like any business, there could be a profit or a loss. It's a business end of the day. But if you do your proper research and due diligence, very likely you will benefit from it. But do that first. Just don't do it for the sake of doing it, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's a good idea to go on to, any of those spare room websites just to find out the demand in the area and kind of the prices that are going at the moment for that particular area and the rooms, right?
Yeah. That's right, that's right.
So point number 5 is something to remember, is that you have to give back the property to the landlord in the order that you got it in. So bear that in mind if you're making lots of changes then, I guess, right, Ifti?
That's right. You've got to be mindful, because if you put partitions, you've got to take it out and just make sure that the walls are in the original condition you got it. So that might have cost involved. So when you're planning, don't think that there's no exit cost. Of course, there's an entry cost because you have this maintenance stuff you have to do up front, but remember there's maintenance at the end as well, right? So you got to sort of take off some of these things and give it in the same order you got it. So if you're trying to do that, there will be costs. So when you're doing your projections, please take these into account, because these are costs that you'll only see at the end, right? Obviously, the success of the project you can measure only over a period of time. So you don't want to get caught out right at the end, right? So just be mindful of this one.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Ifti. Number 6, will the landlord rent out the property to a new rent-to-rent landlord?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's definitely worth considering. It's like getting a new job when you're a freshie, right? Just out of uni, you want a job, right? Obviously, it's not going to be very straightforward. You don't have experience, right? So likewise, if you're trying to buy a property and do rent-to-rent, landlords may be concerned, right? Because you don't have experience in the area. But, you know, like I said, you have to try. If you're interested in the area, you try to find people who will do it. I know people who have successfully done it. They do something called leafleting. They print out leaflets saying house needed and, you know, give the contact details. And people who want to rent out their properties, they write to them or call them and say that, look, we do have a property. You can have conversations with them. Obviously, there is an element of risk from a landlord's point of view, but some are willing to take the risk. Everybody started somewhere, so there's a good chance that you are going to get a property as well, and you know you can do it. But obviously, it's hard at the beginning. But once you're sort of in it, people have seen good results, right? So that's why a lot of people are doing it, right?
Yeah, because I guess from a landlord's perspective, they're getting their rental ask, so then th're happy, they can pay their mortgage, or you know they just get that rental money every month. And then as a rent-to-rent landlord, you're also kind of benefiting too, because you're getting the rent money every month too, right? So it's kind of could be a win-win situation.
Yeah, it could do. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So for some people, it's appealing, right? So and quite often you pay the landlord small premium, so it entices them to give the property. That's what a lot of people do, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ifti. And point number 7: will you have to get your hands dirty? Because there's always a catch, isn't there?
Of course. Yeah. Okay. So this is what I tell people who are thinking of this area. Okay, if you're a landlord having one property, like on a assured tenancy agreement, you know, it's a lot of work, right? Just imagine if you have 4 tenants, right? It's 4 times the work, right? Because obviously, you know, tenants will come and go, and turnover in this kind of area is very high because people don't stay too long, right? They come for a month to maybe, and they go away. So, you know, turnover is high. There's high maintenance as well because you're responsible for keeping the common areas clean, right? So there is a lot of work involved. The tenants might fight against each other and you get the complaints. If there's anything that's not working, you know, you will get the calls, right? So it's 4 times the call. So it's not a thing for everyone. So if you're really busy, may not be your area, right? Because you'll have to handle 4 tenants suddenly, right? If you're doing it yourself. A lot of people do it themselves. So, you know, so just be mindful of that, right? There is a lot of work involved. Of course, it looks very profitable in paper, but there is these things that you have to think about. So before you go on this area.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I feel like typically when you get the property as a rent-to-rent landlord, they usually come furnished. So then that's another thing you've got to think about, potentially, like furniture.
So those are important, and of course the wear and tear as well, right? So because if a lot of people come and go, there's often more wear and tear. So you've got to do replacements maybe a little more frequent than a assured tenancy agreement.
Yeah, and these are kind of some bonus points that I've put down, but I feel like they are kind of important to mention. But, you know, when we're talking about a regular mortgage, we always say, you know, a good solicitor. And what about, obviously with the rent-to-rent, you still have a contract in place with the landlord. As a rent-to-rent landlord, you know, would you suggest getting a solicitor to draft that contract as a rent-to-rent landlord? What would be
I think suggestion? So. Because it's a commercial arrangement. You got to get the agreement right with the landlord itself. So you got to have the terms written properly. I don't think there's proper templates out there. Even if there is, right, you probably want to get a solicitor to check before you use that. And obviously you got to have agreements between you and the tenant as well. So just make sure that those are in order. I know there are a lot of templates out there, but if you're serious about this, think of it long term, because you can't later realize that you've done mistakes with your agreements, right? So let's get the agreements right. So I think that's a very valid point for sure.
Yeah, and then there's just a couple of downsides that I potentially kind of want to mention. One being is like, obviously a rent-to-rent landlord's looking to make a profit, right? But, a lot of people perhaps don't realise is there's actually a lot of work involved in, like you were saying, making sure the property's up to scratch each month with the cleaning and repairs. If someone locks themselves out, you've got to get a locksmith to come and let them in, and you've got, basically 4 different tenants in one house. There could potentially be 4 times the amount of problems. So just to bear in mind that you're kind of taking into consideration your time and how much time you have to put in every month to kind of get that profit back. And if it's something small, like, a £400 profit, like, would that be worth it for the amount of time that you're putting in? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on how you look at it. If you're after the £400, I'm not sure that you want to go through that trouble. But a lot of people who do this, they think, okay, this is going to be my job in future. For somebody who thinks, okay, I want to stop working and do something on my own, this might be an option because your initial outlay may not be as much, right? So obviously you got to pay the first month's rent and the deposit, that kind of thing, but it won't be massive compared to some of the other businesses out there. So if you're thinking of it that way, you can gradually take house by house and do this and maybe give up your daytime job. So if you're planning to do that, then yeah, definitely it's an option, right? But if you're trying to just do one in the side and try to benefit from that, and if you are really busy with your work, it may not be your thing, right? So it depends on how you want to sort of manage your time, right? So that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and then the other downside that I can kind of see, and this is kind of more if you're going to do this really, really long term, but maybe a suggestion would be to do it short term, because basically the downside is you don't get capital growth from the property because essentially you don't own it. And I guess one of the things to be mindful of is, if you did own the property and you say owned it for 5 years, there would be, capital growth there. And to think about, will you be making the same profit if you own the property from doing rent to rent? So maybe, as you were saying before, it's a good way to potentially save some money and get on the property ladder. But I would still say that maybe getting onto the property ladder would be more beneficial long term for a better profit, right?
There's no right answer to this question. Potentially, yes. Obviously, you save that £500 rent, you pay the landlord as well, right? So potentially, yes. But the thing is, most of the time, problem people have is to collect that money to buy that first house. So that's when systems like this help you sort of build up, right? So if you're saving, say, £500 a month, that'll help you build up, right? So at the end of the year, you'll have £6,000, right? So maybe end of 2 years, double that, right? So if you have a couple of houses, you're sort of talking maybe 20,000 savings, sort of thing, right? So that will definitely help you buy your house, right? It is definitely a stepping stone, because if you're struggling to save that money, this is definitely an option for you, right? But it does involve a lot of work, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Ifti. I mean, I hope we've cleared that up for everybody. There are definitely some really positive things to doing rent to rent, and there's also some things to think about when you do rent to rent, like void periods, bills, replenishing the property every year, perhaps replacing tired furniture. But, still, it could be a great way to eventually get yourself on the property ladder. So thanks again, Ifti, for more great advice. I just want to do our regular reminders that these points may or may not be applicable to everybody, so please do talk to an advisor if you're unsure if they're suitable for you. If you don't have an advisor, I will leave our WS contact details below, as we're more than happy and we do offer free advice. A little reminder that a mortgage is secured against your home or property, so it may be repossessed if you do not keep up with the mortgage repayments. Thank you for joining us again today. We'll be back next week with another episode of Let's Talk Money and Mortgages. Have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.